Gracias a profesor Álvarez Ruf y también, claro, el profesor Burgos Concha, que tan amablemente me han invitado a participar en esto, porque pues para mí es una oportunidad muy placentera realmente de poder compartir este tipo de ciencia con todos ustedes. Lo que sí les agradecería, lo mismo que le pido a mis estudiantes cuando estábamos enseñando, dando clases en Zoom, es si pudieran prender sus cámaras. Si se puede, porque entonces esto humaniza un poco la situación y no solo estoy hablando con mis colegas, sino estoy viendo a la gente para quien realmente es esta actividad que tanto trabajo cuesta para los organizadores y para nosotros los partícipes es un gran placer. Quisiera comenzar con una pequeña introducción. Tenemos a Andrew Irwin. Andrew Irwin es un postdoctor en mi laboratorio aquí en la Universidad del Sur de California, en Los Ángeles, donde tienen su casa. Y Andrew Irwin es ingeniero mecánico que ha trabajado con sistemas robóticos para poder medir actividad cerebral durante lo que se llama fMRI, la resonancia magnética, y después trabajó con JPL, el Jet Propulsion Laboratory, con NASA, diseñando sismógrafos para la Luna, pero realmente su pasión es en la ingeniería aplicada a problemas de humanos de la control motriz. Muchas gracias, Andrew. Y también quisiera presentar a Angelo Bach Jiménez, que es un compatriota suyo. Él es chileno de Valparaíso, que es profesor de terapia física ahí, pero quiere profundizar su conocimiento en las áreas de la ingeniería. Entonces está haciendo el doctorado aquí con nosotros en USC. Bienvenido, Angelo. Y entonces, si alguno de ustedes tiene dudas, preguntas de cómo es que se hacen los posgrados, etcétera, Angelo ya en carne propia ha vivido la experiencia. Pero entonces quisiera agradecerles a ustedes su presencia y mi intención es darles una muy rapidita visión del control neuromuscular de la manera que yo lo entiendo desde el punto de vista matemático. Y entonces yo tengo realmente dos metas. La primera es darles una visión un poco general de este tipo de trabajo, uno. Y dos, también hacer hincapié en el sentido de que el inglés es muy importante para poder continuar la participación en esta área. Hoy en día el inglés es la lengua franca que tenemos que enfrentar, como antes era el alemán o el francés o el español, ahora le toca el inglés. Bueno, pues hablemoslo en inglés. Entonces voy a estar dando la mayoría de la plática en inglés, pero con algunos puntos en español para cerciorarme de que los puntos principales sí estén siendo seguidos. Y con mucho gusto, ahora voy a compartir mi pantalla. ¿Y la ven ustedes? ¿Está todo bien?
Perfecto.
Sí, muchas gracias. So what I would like to do is I would like to talk to you about feasibility theory, essentially give you an overview of the main debates that are happening in neuromuscular control nowadays in this field that is the intersection of mathematics, biology, rehabilitation, artificial intelligence, and engineering, of course. So this is what I'm trying to discuss with you today. And the main idea is as follows, is that evolution is brain-body coevolution. Oftentimes we have neuroscientists talking about neuroscience and neurons and the wonderful brain. And we have people in biomechanics talking about the body and the muscles and the skeleton in a very consistent way. However, as evolution happened, it was really a coevolution of brain and body. And so it's important to consider it as that. And I think that many of the current come from our losing sight of this fact that the body as the our body is as important as the brain, and our brain is as important as the body. So let me tell you the main messages that I would like you to take away from this. So the first one is that a perspective that uses mathematically the treatment of tendons as the actuators of the body is very important. And another thing is that in this literature that is very broad, it can be confusing to people who start reading it. So you have three different perspectives that oftentimes become different communities that don't talk to each other. But I believe that there is a way to see this as a whole, as the same thing. And then I'd like to talk about muscle redundancy, which has often been called the central problem of motor control. And then I talk into details about how is it that we think the brain is actually working. Entonces, los mensajes principales que yo quisiera darles a ustedes es la perspectiva de que necesitamos entender cómo es que el sistema nervioso controla tendones. El sistema nervioso no controla motores, ni torcas, ni engranes, controla motores que jalan en los tendones. Entonces es una actuación muy particular. Y entendiendo esta actuación se pueden entender muchas cosas. Y también principalmente las tres diferentes escuelas dominantes en la teoría de control motriz pueden realmente verse como parte de la misma solución, sin tener que estar separándonos en diferentes, llamémosle, perspectivas. Y otra cosa que me gustaría platicar es esta idea de redundancia muscular. Generalmente se dice que tenemos demasiados músculos. Y bueno, ¿es eso cierto o no? ¿Y por qué es que el cuerpo es como es? ¿Y qué podemos hacer desde la perspectiva de control motriz o rehabilitación? Entonces, so the important thing is to understand that organisms, as we see them, are essentially machines that evolved having to obey two main masters. The first one was Newton. Essentially, the physics of the world determined what a body can and can't do. And then on top of that, there is the evolutionary process of competition within and across species. And so whatever it is that we see organisms as doing or how they are put together is a direct result of this. And because brain-body coevolution is so important, then I think we should talk about neuromechanics, not biomechanics or not neuroscience, but rather neuromechanics. And this is actually a term that was coined by a friend of mine, Roger Enoka, in the 80s, because he, as a very good neuroscientist, recognized that he could not understand muscle function and the control of muscle function without understanding the body. So we're grateful to Roger Enoka for that. So the purpose of this talk is to explore the role of mechanics and data science to understand neuromuscular control. So this is where is the field today? But actually, more importantly, how can you contribute to this field today? And for those people whose cameras I can see, can you raise your hand if the English explanation is working for you? Yes, so English is okay, mostly? All right, so good. So I'll continue to do this. So there are multiple papers you can find on our website, but the central problem now is that people talk about the problem of motor control as one of optimization, one of synergy control, or one of Bayesian inference. And so what I will do is I will walk through some mathematical arguments about how these three ways of looking at the same problem are actually compatible and complementary to each other. Entonces, la idea principal aquí es de que hay tres escuelas dominantes hoy en día. Una es la de optimización, otra es el control a través de sinergias, y la otra es control probabilístico a través del sistema, de la perspectiva bayesiana. Entonces, lo que yo quisiera hacer es presentar argumentos matemáticos de cómo estas tres perspectivas realmente son son diferentes maneras de ver la misma cosa. Esencialmente, cómo la mecánica y el control neuronal se acoplan uno con el otro. Entonces, the problem with our field today, as I see it, is that we all agree on physics and mathematics and recordings and EMG and kinematics. We all agree on that. So we collect data and we have theories, but we're nevertheless fragmented into schools of thought that oftentimes actually talk past each other, that we agree to disagree. So if you like optimization, that's great, but I do synergies. So, you can't, I mean, my perspective is as good at you as yours. So there is this idea of equality, which is fine. And I think it keeps the field interacting with each other. But the idea is, how do we make progress? And so I think the main message is to you is, as a person starting out in this field, with so many papers already published, so many smart people before you who have done a lot of work, where do you come in? How can you contribute? And there's a book that then became a movie. It's called The Help. It's about the 60s and racial tensions in the United States in the 60s. And we have a woman who joins a newspaper, and she's a young writer, and she wants to get a career in writing. And so she asked the editor, like, how do I even begin? How do I even start to become like you and be a proper writer? And so what the advice to her was, okay, get an entry-level job, right? Start at the beginning. And you can tell this is from the 60s. You may even know what mimeographs are. It's a way to make photocopies. The Xerox machine came in, but then PDFs have made it obsolete. But anyway, so what the advice to her was, look around and don't waste your time writing about obvious things. Write about what disturbs you, particularly if it bothers no one else. So as you look at the field and you read these papers, don't believe them. Read them from a perspective of objectivity and see whether or not you agree with what's being said. Entonces, lo que yo quisiera compartirles es la idea de que para empezar a trabajar en cualquier área, lo primero es empezar por el principio, pero también tratar de entender qué es lo que para ti mismo no tiene sentido, especialmente si no le molesta a otra gente. O sea, hay gente que habla del área de una manera y está bien, pero no crean todo lo que está escrito. Si no hace sentido para ti, investígalo. Si sí hace sentido, adelante, pero las cosas que no hagan sentido, trata de entender por qué. Y es ahí donde puedes hacer muchas contribuciones. So the idea here is, what bothered me was that as I was a PhD student and a master's student, people were talking about muscle redundancy. And there were people talking about legs, talking about monoarticular muscles and biarticular muscles. So you may remember those terms, and they even are used today, right? Biarticular muscle, monoarticular muscle, agonist, antagonist. And people are using the knee or the elbow. But I was working on the hand, and I was thinking, if only I were so lucky, because when you work with hands, you work on triarticular, pentarticular, heptarticular muscles that cross many, many joints, not just one or two. And here you have a community that's debating whether crossing one or two joints is important. I don't have that problem. I have the problem, what happens when you cross 7 joints? And why do we have so many muscles? And, you know, and people talk about muscle redundancy, but why would we evolve to have so many muscles? But people were not necessarily questioning that. But it kind of bothered me a little bit. I said, well, why I want to understand this. So then let's talk about muscle redundancy. And the idea of muscle redundancy is that we have more muscles than kinematic degrees of freedom. So this allows infinite solutions. And this is all correct. However, there is the issue that people take this to mean that the nervous system is solving an optimization problem. And the reason people think this is because as engineers, whenever we're faced with such a situation, we always think optimization. That's how we get out of these problems in engineering. Now, the question is, does the nervous system actually optimize? And 2, do we really have many muscles? So I started investigating these ideas because if we believe that we have too many muscles and we have to optimize, etc., if you really believe that we have too many muscles, which one would you like to donate? You can use Botox and paralyze any muscle in your body, but why don't athletes do it? And why do people seek clinical treatment even after mild pathology if we have so many muscles? Or why, in the evolutionary scale, why would a species evolve, encode, grow, maintain, repair, control an extra muscle? Because evolution is here and now. If you're able to solve a problem now, you make it to the next generation. So if you have too many muscles and you're being wasteful, then there should be an evolutionary pathway for animals to have fewer muscles and waste less energy and consume less energy, etc. So you can talk about situations like that. And what I'd like to do is I put this all down. Everything that you see that I'm saying is in this book that you can download for free if your university has Springer Link. Also, you can go to that website and watch every one of my lectures for the class that follows this book. So it's all available for you to see in detail. So I'll just touch a few of the high points because we do need to be done by 11:20, and I hope that we have time for a few questions. So let me just go to the idea that you have a brain, you have a spinal cord, and you have muscles, bones, and joints, etc. But what's actually controlling the limbs are tendons. We don't have motors at the joints. We have tendons that are pulling, right? And so what happens in the nervous system is that in the forward direction, in the causal direction of events, you have a muscle activation that drives the muscles, and then that produces muscle forces, which then produces joint torques because you're pulling on tendons, which then acts through the bones, and then you have a mechanical output. In this particular case, a static force. And so what I'd like to do is for you to take a leap of faith and think geometrically here. So let me tell you what I mean by this. So if you have 3 muscles, you can control each muscle at a level between 0 and 1. That means that every possible motor command is a point inside this cube. So what the brain needs to decide is find a way to select a point in this space that is appropriate for the task. Because as soon as you select a point in that space, that becomes a point in muscle force space, that becomes a point in the torques that you produce, and that becomes an output force. And here you can see the dimensionality of the transition that you go from 3 muscles, say, to 3 muscle activations to 3 muscle forces. Now it's the same three-dimensional space, but each point is not just the combination of activations to the muscles, but actually the muscle forces. Now that gets mapped into a combination of torque. So if this is a two joint system, then it's the value of the torque at joint 1 and the value of the torque at joint 2, and then the force at the output at the static force that's coming out of this planar system. So this is what we're looking at here. So imagine that you have a two-joint system. This is, of course, a cartoon, but it tells a story. You have two joints, three muscles. So then you must select the activation across muscle 1, 2, 3 that will produce a combination of forces 1, 2, 3. And those three forces are transmitted through tendons that will produce a torque about joint 1, joint 2. And that torque about joint 1, joint 2 is going to produce an output force here. And so the idea here is that if we think geometrically, we can actually go from anatomy to muscle output. So take muscle number 1. If muscle number 1 is activated at a level of, say, 1, then its muscle force is going to be maximal, and its torque, because it crosses two joints, is going to be a combination of torques about joint 1 and joint 2, and that will produce some output at the end point. Now, let's look at muscle 2. Muscle 2, again, can be activated between 0 and 1, which means between 0 and, say, 720 newtons. But that force is going to produce a combination of torques about two joints because it crosses two joints, you see here and here. And then that's going to result in some output. And then if you talk about muscle 3, when it's activated at its maximal level, it's producing so many newtons. But notice that it only crosses one joint in the static situation. It will then only produce a torque about joint 1, not about joint 2, right? And this will produce then some output. So the fundamental idea here is that the only thing the nervous system can do is combine the activation of muscle 1, 2, and 3. And that combination will produce some output that is mecánico. Entonces, el punto aquí es, si lo vemos de manera geométrica, tenemos una anatomía con los diferentes tres músculos que sus tendones cruzan diferentes articulaciones. Entonces, lo que podemos ver es de que cuando se excita el músculo 1, músculo 2, músculo 3, van a tener una consecuencia muy particular en las torcas que se pueden generar en la articulación 1 o 2 y que entonces van a producir una fuerza estática en el extremo de este miembro, que va a ser esto. Entonces, lo único que puede hacer el sistema nervioso es combinar estos vectores. Ese es el punto principal. So, if we look at it from this perspective, we want to know what is the feasible output of a limb. Essentially, what can a limb do? Because what I'm saying here is that all the nervous system can do is exploit the mechanical capabilities of the limb, of the muscles, etc. So if you look at it from this perspective, each muscle, by its anatomical routing, has the ability to produce a net torque about joint 1 and joint 2. So then we can ask the question about muscle redundancy. We can ask the question about muscle actions in different directions, etc. For example, if you only had two muscles, combining these two muscles can only bring you into this region, which means that you can produce net joint torques in this region here. Now, if you add a third muscle, then you can produce forces that span this region in the torque 1, torque 2 domain. And so here you can begin to see several things. First is that muscles need to be appropriately routed, but also that adding one more muscle always adds to your capabilities. While it's redundant to control, maybe, it's always increasing your potential of action. So for example, if I add muscle force, now I can span sort of this region. And because the region of possible torques includes the origin, that means that you can produce positive and negative torques about both joints. So then this now becomes, this is a controllable limb, say. So you could also do it with fewer muscles. Here you can even get away with only 3 muscles. So then what I would ask you is, would you like another muscle? And you would say, well, we'll make the system more redundant. And I would say, yes, it would make it more redundant. But what if you needed to produce torques that were of greater magnitude in torque 1 and negative in torque 2? So in this case, adding muscle 5 actually buys you a region of actuation that you didn't have before. So the idea is that when you're looking at the number of muscles relative to the number of joints, it's not just a matter of subtracting one from the other. It's actually a matter of seeing what one muscle adds to your overall capabilities. And so if you look at this, then you see that this is a region that muscle 5 is getting you. So then if I were selling you this limb for you to use at home, I would say, well, just today I can give you a very good price on muscle 5. Would you like to have muscle 5, right? So you'd say, I don't need it, but it would certainly be good to have. So yes, if you give me a good price, I'll take muscle 5, right? So this idea that more really is better, but a more formal way of saying this is that every muscle that you add to your body has the ability to expand your abilities. It's not a bad thing to have more muscles. And so if I asked you this, which one would you give up, right? Because every muscle that you give up actually costs you. So now let me see something. I think I may be missing an important slide here. No, that's okay. We'll just continue here. Let me just share again. Okay. So there are many things that we can discuss about this, but just for the sake of moving forward, as we only have a few minutes left, I just wanted to show you that you can use computational geometry and anatomy to address problems like, for example, if I have an arm and I have 3 muscles controlling it, this is then the feasible output space. And then the question is, how do I find a solution for a particular force output? And let's say that I wanted to produce this amount of force, which is submaximal. Now, if you go to a maximal output force, the solution is unique, because what's happening is that every extreme point of your force output actually means that one of your muscles is maxing out. So then you cannot take a muscle beyond its maximal activation, and that actually produces a unique solution. But for a submaximal force, to produce it, you have to describe it. And the way we describe it is by saying, well, its x component has to be this value. But then that becomes a linear equation that in the space of muscle activations is actually a plane. And this plane is saying that all the forces that can produce that vector must be inside of the cube and on that plane. Now, if you add another constraint where you say, well, but the vertical magnitude of that force has to be a given amount, that's a second constraint. But that second constraint is also a linear equation that you can bring here and see it in the perspective of the muscle activation. So then to produce that particular force, you have to be in the cube on plane 1 and on plane 2. And if a solution exists, that means that all the activation patterns that are valid must be on that line. So the main point here is that to produce a submaximal force, there are many solutions because a line has infinite number of points. But those solutions are not random. They're very highly structured, and they're determined by the anatomy and by the task. And so sometimes people say, yeah, well, but there is redundancy. How do you pick a solution inside of here? And you say, yes, that's fine, but every solution is very much related to the other. There's a very well-defined solution space. So this is what we call the feasible solution space for it. And now, but how can this be clinically useful? Let's talk about it. So imagine you have the same situation, constraint 1 and constraint 2. You want to produce this one force. So someone walks into your clinic and their arm, is not working right. Okay, so what you do is you want to understand how this solution space looks, right? So here again, we have this line, but a way to understand it is by looking at the ranges of activations that this line includes. This is sometimes called the bounding box. So if you do this, then you could see that every solution to this task has muscle 1 within this range, muscle 2 within this range, and muscle 3 within that range. So what you can say is that in principle, you can give up muscle 2 because it's equivalent to having muscle 2 at 0, right? But if muscle 2 is 0, you need to have very specific relationships between muscle 1 and muscle 3. So you could say that it's not strictly necessary for that particular task, but let's actually look at it in a different perspective. Look at muscle 1. Muscle 1 needs to be activated at this level. So can you lose muscle 1? And the idea is that you cannot, because if you don't have muscle 1, that task becomes impossible. And so what you may be able to then explore is, okay, here you have a submaximal force, and I have a redundant system. But if I lose even one muscle, I cannot do a submaximal task. So this is interesting, right? So then redundancy is not just a generic term. You have to be careful. So some muscles are more redundant than others. But there are other consequences to this. So for example, what happens if in this patient, muscle 1 is available, but is weaker? I don't know, they had some peripheral nerve damage or something. And muscle 1, even though it's there, falls out of this region of activation. And the patient comes to you and says, hey, I have my muscle, I'm just a little bit weaker, but I cannot do this anymore. And you say, well, that's interesting. And now you could actually see how disability can emerge from even weakness in one muscle. And so again, this is just the idea that redundancy, that it has many shades to it. Now, there are other kinds of clinical conditions like in cerebral palsy where you have spasticity. Well, if a muscle is overactive, and let's say that muscle 1 or muscle 2 are overactive, then the person will not be able to perform that task. And so that actually begins to explain some disabilities in stroke or in cerebral palsy or spinal cord injury, right? Where, sure, you have redundant muscles, but the relationship between the muscle activations is what's important, right? And so the extension of this is that, and this is something that we are about to publish, is how these feasible activation sets are actually moving around in space. So then the job of the nervous system is to understand how these solution spaces are evolving in time and how to learn how to be in a solution space. So just so that we do not run out of time, I will show you one last set of experiments, and then we'll open it up for questions. So the question is, can we do this for high dimensional systems, not just toy problems? So some of the work that we do in the lab actually combines the 16th and 21st centuries, where we take anatomical preparations, but we then begin to control them with computers. And we want to understand what the feasible activation sets are for a finger. So this is done with many collaborators. This takes people in mathematics, neuroscience, hand surgery, computer science, mechanical engineering. I really enjoy building these interdisciplinary teams where we can actually put to an experimental test these ideas. And so imagine that you have a finger that has 7 muscles. And if it has 7 muscles and you want to produce a task, meaning a static force, then what you would do is you'd say, well, what are the solutions? This is from data collected in those hands. What is the solution if I wanted to produce forces sideways or with a given magnitude? It's a submaximal magnitude. And what you see is that these are the ranges that the muscles can be activated in. But then you say, actually, that doesn't help me because I want the force to be pointed accurately, right? Let's say that I want it to be on that plane. And now you begin to see that even for this 7-dimensional system, so here we're talking about 7 dimensions that we cannot visualize, but we can sort of see. Here you see that you begin to get some structure, that some muscles need to be active at low levels, others need to be active at high levels, other can be anywhere. And then you say, but yeah, but I actually want to pick something up. I want to do a well-directed force. And so for that well-directed force, you see that the structure emerges, right? And so to me, this is a key to going into understanding disability, right? When you say, if you have a body with given mechanics, and then you have a task with given requirements, then the job of the brain is to find and exploit those regions. So now you see that optimization is a way to find a point in that region. Now you see that synergies is a way to describe that low dimensional region, right? Because that's what synergies do. They say, oh, it's a low dimensional system. Yes, it is low dimensional because it's a 5-dimensional object in a 7-dimensional space. And then if you were a Bayesian person, you would say, oh, then you can use trial and error to try to find a point in that solution space and then just remember it and use it. So this is a way in which we bring together the 3 different perspectives in motor control. And what I'd like to do is now simply conclude by saying, again, what we were talking about was how these feasible activation sets can present themselves in ways that 3 schools of thought can explore and study them. We have moved on to do this in very, very, rigorous computational ways to visualize these. And I come back to the same points I wanted to make before. A tendon-driven perspective is useful. The 3 dominant perspectives of motor control can actually be seen as different facets of the same problem. And we likely have as many muscles as we need, because the more muscles you have, the more constraints you can meet in the real world. Dimensionality reduction is expected in natural behavior. So the idea of synergies is actually something we would have expected. Now, whether or not the brain uses synergies to control is a different story. And then the choice of cost function is a matter of opinion. And so, in my opinion, the challenge is to understand how the nervous system finds and explores and exploits these solution spaces, which actually may be the reason why we have motor habits, why people, as they develop as children, or as you learn a new task, you first have to find one solution, and then if it's good enough, you just keep it. And lastly, this is a picture of a dated picture of the lab. Some people are still in the lab, namely two, Ali and myself. The others have graduated. This is another picture from another time, and I think Andrew and Angelo need to come up with a better picture soon. So I'll open this for questions. I'd like to thank our funding sources, and then hopefully this was of use to you.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Thank you, professor, for your awesome talk. Muchas gracias.
I hope I didn't go too quickly and that the English language was not too much of a barrier.
No, and always it's a challenge to start thinking in a different way that we haven't had much access, you know, like because here in Chile, I believe we have more about into synergies, model control, equilibrium point hypothesis, optimization models, and to me it's really interesting to think, just even think and say, okay, is really a redundancy problem? This is a problem, as you say. I mean, let's take a muscle out.
Yes.
So it's almost from philosophy to engineering and demonstration of it. So really amused with it. Hay algunas preguntas, profesor.
¿Alguna pregunta?
Sí.
Porque me encantaría saber de los partícipes si hay alguna pregunta.
Sí. Hay unas que las escribieron en la plataforma.
Perfecto.
Pero además creo que la persona que quiera activar su micrófono puede hacerlo para preguntar, ¿no? Pero voy a leerle unas que dejaron en la plataforma ahora. Dice una, ¿cómo las fuerzas del ambiente pueden modificar la interacción entre tendón-hueso, o de la unidad tendón-hueso?
Las fuerzas externas, me imagino.
Sí.
So, generalmente nosotros suponemos que la estructura interna del cuerpo es constante. Generalmente esa es la suposición que hacemos. Pero hay ejemplos muy buenos de cómo hay una interacción íntima entre el ambiente y el cuerpo. Un ejemplo sencillo es la de las contracciones excéntricas. O sea, cuando una fuerza externa fuerza que se extienda una articulación. Y eso lo hacemos todos los días cuando bajamos escaleras. Cuando bajamos escaleras, el peso de la gravedad hace que nuestras rodillas se flexionen. Entonces, la interacción entre las fuerzas externas hacen que ese músculo, en vez de que sea un músculo que produce fuerzas positivas y genere trabajo, se convierta en un elemento que absorbe energía. Y entonces está generando energía negativa. Y entonces esto es lo que hace que seamos hasta cierto punto muy eficientes, porque bajar unas escaleras nos cuesta menos trabajo que subir las escaleras. Claro, genera un poco de micro daño en el músculo, que es lo que usa la gente para ganar volumen muscular y tener hipertrofia, etcétera. Pero estas facultades de las propiedades del músculo, del tejido del músculo, son admirables, y entonces hacen que nosotros podamos generar energía de trabajo negativo más fácilmente que positivo, y eso es una buena consecuencia. Entonces, este es solo un ejemplo de esto.
Claro. Acá hay otra pregunta que dice, ¿cómo entiende la interacción de las unidades motoras de la médula espinal con los tendones en este modelo?
Esa es una muy buena pregunta, porque generalmente nosotros pensamos que tenemos las neuronas en la médula espinal serían las neuronas alfa, que son las que activan el músculo en sí. si ven a partir del capítulo, me parece que es el capítulo 7, en que empezamos a hablar sobre eso. Hay algo muy crítico que una vez más la gente tiende a ignorar, pero para mí es algo muy importante. Es algo que dijo Sherrington en 1895. Sherrington es, digamos, el padre de la fisiología de la médula espinal. Él dijo que la inhibición es tan importante como la activación. Y a lo que voy con esto es el sistema gamma, o sea, los muscle spindles, los reflejos, los arcos reflejos. Entonces, mucho del trabajo que estamos haciendo hoy en día es entender cómo los circuitos neuronales de los arcos reflejos tienen que ser modulados y superados para poder generar control motor. Unos de nuestros últimos artículos indican que el control motor es redundante desde el punto de vista de que hay muchos músculos, pero también es, ¿cómo dirías overdetermined, Angelo? En español, o sea, es cuando se tienen más
Sobredeterminado.
ecuaciones que variables.
No.
O sea, un sistema redundante es cuando hay más variables que ecuaciones. Un sistema invertible es cuando hay igual número de variables y ecuaciones. Pero este sistema está sobredeterminado donde hay más ecuaciones que variables. Que de haber alguna solución, o hay 0 soluciones o a lo mucho una. Entonces, cuando empezamos a considerar los arcos reflejos en el sistema nervioso, en la médula espinal, vemos que el sistema nervioso realmente está trabajando de manera que tienen 0 libertad. Si un solo músculo, cuando yo hago esto, si uno de los músculos que se están extendiendo tiene un arco reflejo demasiado activo o sencillamente no es mitigado, entonces la función se va a comprometer, se va a disrumpir. Entonces, solo les he presentado realmente el capítulo 1 a 3 del libro, ¿no? El libro sigue 4, 5, 6. Lo importante, yo creo que donde la actividad y el mayor avance puede venir en el futuro del sistema neuromuscular es considerando los circuitos neuronales que se encuentran en la médula espinal.
Gracias.
Y mandé nuestra página de internet, que es valerolab.org. Ahí pueden leer todos esos artículos y los otros capítulos del libro hablan sobre esto. ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Francisco, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Es muy interesante la forma en que lo planteas. Otra forma de pensar el problema del control motor. Y vinculada a la última pregunta, me quedé pensando en la interacción temporal de la médula espinal con el músculo y por supuesto cómo afecta en el fondo la combinatoria temporal de las unidades motoras en esta interacción que hace el tendón con el hueso, en el sentido de que cuando uno estudia electromiografía ve que es una actividad bien oscilatoria o cambiante, que en el fondo
Sí.
se van reclutando algunas fibras y luego otras dejan de participar. Y entonces a veces uno se queda con la duda si dentro de la unidad como músculo-tendón es como que es indiferente combinar algunas u otras y si en el fondo es importante como la combinatoria temporal y espacial de alguna forma de las distintas fibras. En el fondo.
Sí, ¿habrán 3 minutos o ya tenemos que terminar?
Hay tiempo, profesor.
Justo.
¿Y habrán 3 minutos? Ok. Quisiera tomarme la libertad de darles más información todavía, si me permiten. Algo que hemos estado haciendo es esencialmente eso, el decir, ¿cómo es que podemos considerar las actividades neuronales en tiempo que consideran la arquitectura de las neuronas en la médula espinal? Y esta es una extensión de los proyectos, y lo que hacemos es usamos chips, FPGAs, para simular neuronas que están disparando, pero estamos simulando miles de neuronas a la vez que están conectadas a un sistema mecánico. Y cuando hacemos eso, podemos generar robots que empiezan a comportarse como se comportan nuestros dedos, nuestras articulaciones, etcétera. Porque ahí también hasta podemos sacar la electromiografía de las neuronas alfa, y también podemos generar experimentos en los que estamos viendo si nuestra actividad neuronal se parece a lo que ha sido publicado. Y entonces son un ejemplo de cómo podemos estar viendo nosotros la simulación de la actividad neuronal a nivel de los mecanorreceptores y las poblaciones de motoneuronas alfa en la médula espinal que estamos nosotros simulando, y cómo podemos empezar a cambiar la actividad temporal gamma que maneja este tipo de reflejos, de arcos reflejos, en tiempo. Y lo que podemos ver es que hay una vez más regiones de visibilidad, de factibilidad, donde la interacción dinámica entre la regulación de la médula espinal y la función motriz es la que da regiones que son factibles. Entonces estamos empezando a estudiar cómo es que podemos empezar a darle detalles a esa pregunta tan importante que el profesor Burgos Concha nos hace, que es cómo podemos empezar a comprender la actividad neuronal en el tiempo.
Muchas
del
gracias.
sistema fisiológico, sí.
Muy interesante la simulación.
Profesor, reiterar los agradecimientos por su generosidad.
No, el placer es mío, muchas gracias.
Gracias. Por supuesto, también desearle todo el éxito a Ángelo ahí, que parte está dejando ahí la bandera por allá de Chile. Y
Sí,
bien. Andrew, nice to meet you. Bueno, nos volveremos a ver en algún momento. Muchas gracias, profesor.
Sí, esperemos que algún día so we hope someday that Andrew, Angela, and I can come visit and not only discuss this in more depth, but also enjoy the wonderful country that Chile is. And I have always had only positive experience with Chileans. So there's something in the water in Chile that makes people extremely nice and pleasant. So thank you for that. Muchas gracias. Hermana República de Chile.
Gracias, profesor.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias y hasta luego.
Bye, goodbye, Andrew. Chao a todos.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias que te-
Bye, everyone. Ciao, que estén
Bye,
bien.
nice to meet you.
Chao.